From the EPR Creation Studio, this is Doc Staples bringing you Unconquered with Doc Staples. As always, this podcast brought to you by EPR Creations, bringing you the best of internet marketing and website development for an affordable price. By Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida. If you're in the Ponte Vedra or Nocatee area, the Jacksonville area, the greater Jacksonville area in general, look him up. If you need any sort of real estate purchases or listings, anything like that, let him know you heard about him from the Unconquered podcast with Doc Staples. By Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina. By Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida. And by Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky. All right, it's time. The season is here. I'm recording this, releasing for Friday, and I'm ready to roll. By the time you're listening to this, it'll either be Friday or it will be game day. Finally, long off season after an even longer and more miserable season here for Florida State to show whether there's anything different from last year. And I'm telling you right now, there's a whole lot different. We'll talk about that as we get going. But let's go ahead and get moving on this. First of all, I actually want to start with a question and answer thing. I had a great question come in, and the question goes as follows. I'm guessing that the vast majority of Bama fans probably know of or recognize maybe 3 or 4 guys on FSU's current roster: Castellanos, Roydell, Squirrel, maybe Earl Little. If you could pick 2 guys, one from each side of the ball, and all Alabama fans would absolutely know after the game is over, to give the Seminoles the best chance of pulling off the unlikely upset, who would you choose? And then he says, my choices would be James William and Usman Kroma. If Bama fans woke up this coming Sunday morning and knew who these two guys are, then I would like our chances of grabbing the win. That's a great question. Great question. And really, it's for me, there of the guys that you have not mentioned, and specifically you mentioned the guys that they probably already know, and that would be Castellanos, Roydell, Squirrel, Earl Little. Might add Daryl Jackson to the list of the people that they already know, because otherwise it's got to be Daryl Jackson. But they probably already know about him. On the defensive side, to me, it's probably Jason Jenkins, the transfer from Tennessee, who I think is the most talented defensive lineman on this roster, not named Daryl Jackson. And I think him being healthy and full go for this game is one of the things that actually gives Florida State a real chance in this game. And I think if Florida State's gonna win this game, they're gonna have to get wins from their defensive line against what may well be the best offensive line in the country. And Jason Jenkins is a guy that actually has the capacity to do that sort of thing. So I would say Jenkins would be one. Now the wild card here is, Florida State wins this game. Odds are it's because of a turnover or two. So whoever generates that turnover, if we're talking about Jerry Wilson, one of those guys, whoever actually generates the turnover or two that change the game, that would be who Alabama fans would remember after that as well. But I don't think that that's exactly predictable. So I'm going with the defensive line theme there with Jason Jenkins. On the offensive side, I think it's really 2 guys, but I'm going to go with Deuce Robinson as the primary here, because I think he's the one guy that in terms of matchups is he's a nightmare for teams in a lot of the same ways that Johnny Wilson was, and then Keon Coleman was, to where you put him one-on-one with just about anybody and you feel like he's going to come down a victor most of the time. And what that does is it gives an offense like this a trump card where it's like, oh, it's 3rd and 8. You know what? We're going to take our one-on-one shot and go a 70-30 ball to that guy. And, if Florida State wins, he's probably looking at 6-7 catches for 100 plus, including a bunch of key conversions and maybe a touchdown or 2, because of the way that they're going to have to be able to use that matchup advantage and the enormous catch radius that he has and the big play potential that he has for a quarterback that really needs that from a guy like that. Castellanos is not the most accurate guy in the world, and he needs that kind of player. I mean, it's a lot like what the benefit that Jordan Travis got when he actually got that kind of receiver on the roster. All of a sudden, that just transformed what he was able to do. Same kind of thing here. The other one, though, and I said there were really two, there's another who I don't think is going to have that kind of outsized impact on the game in terms of, I think Deuce Robinson, we would be looking at, if Florida State wins this game, we'd be looking at a combination of quantity and quality. I also have a sneaking suspicion that folks are going to remember Randy Pittman after this game, because I think Gus and Mike Norvell are going to have something where Pittman is going to break free for some sort of big play that's going to come out of nowhere, whether that's a tight end screen, whether that's a tight end leak, a little wheel route of some sort on the backside of something. There's going to be something where they're going to have that held back. And then at some key moment in the game, you're going to see Pittman taken off upfield, wide open, and potentially running it in. And I think that's something that we can kind of expect. And again, you'll kind of, everybody would remember that. So similar to the interception side of this, I do think we're going to see a huge play from Randy Pittman at some point, just because of how Gus and Mike like to scheme their offense and what they're going to do in the run game, and how much they like his big play capacity and being able to use him for some of those things. So that would be my choice. Those would be my choices, I would say. Okay, so let's go ahead and get to the actual preview part of this podcast and the breakdown of these two teams. And we're going to start with just a little bit of the introduction to kind of how I'm thinking about this game. Number one, there are a ton of unknowns in this game. I mean, we're flying more blind than usual. I mean, Florida State has either 9 or 10 new starters on offense, depending on who actually starts, at some of these positions, but either 9 or 10 new starters on offense. And these are all guys who weren't even in the program last year. It's a completely different offense. So if you're looking at what happened last year, you basically have to throw it completely out, because none of those players are back. There are really only 3 guys from the opening game last year who were significant players who are back for this one. And that's Richie Leonard, who got hurt, missed a good portion of last year, Roydell Williams, who got hurt in September, and Jalen Lucas, who got hurt in September. So the only guys that are returning that are expected to have any sort of real contribution, the guys that were returning starters, that are returning to potentially be effectively starters in that opening play, the only guys are guys that weren't even on the field for a good portion of last year. Everybody else is new. And yeah, you got Amari Williams and Landon Thomas as key backups who were, key players late last year. But that's it. So we're flying more blind on that side than ordinarily we would be. And then there's about 7 new starters on defense, depending on how you add it up and exactly who winds up starting that first snap. And 4 of them weren't even in the program last year. So, I mean, it's a very, very different team from what you had from last year, plus the 2 new coordinators, a complete scheme shift on defense. I mean, the scheme shift on offense is much more subtle because what Norvell was doing was already Malzahn stuff. So it's more of a wrinkle difference than it is a radical transition. On defense, it's been radical. And then for Alabama, you're looking at a team that's in year 2 of a transition from into the post-Nick Saban era. Starting a new quarterback who's unproven, with some questions on defense and in the backfield. And, they're actually schematically, they're still transitioning to a different system from what Saban used to run, less pattern matching and so on. And this is a team that very much had some highs and lows last year, very inconsistent football team last year, and struggled down the stretch, getting shut down by Alabama and the shell of a Michigan roster in the postseason exhibition game as well. Last year, they had highs where they beat Georgia 41-34 in a game where Georgia turned it over a bunch. Alabama was +3 that game. They beat South Carolina. They shut out Missouri 34-0, and they blasted LSU 42-13. So those are their highs. I mean, Alabama's highs last year were about as high as anybody's. And then their lows, losses at Vandy 40-35, at Tennessee 24-17, at Oklahoma 24-3. Notice a commonality here, all games on the road. And then in the bowl game to the shadow squad of Michigan, 19-13. So which Alabama is Florida State going to see? And how much has Alabama moved forward from last year's transition year? And how much are they really Kalen DeBoer's team now? And, how is that match? How much are they going to match his vision? And how much does that match what Bama really has on the roster? There's a lot of questions coming into this game. So we're going to go ahead and start that then with a look at Florida State's defense against Alabama's offense. Now, a couple things to really reinforce here. Number one is this is not the Alabama of old in the way that they go about things. This is not an Alabama team that just lines up and pounds the rock over and over and over again. This is not 2009 Alabama with Saban, who he wants to run it 40 times a game and so on and wear you out. The old crockpot Alabama where it might be, 17-3 at the half, but then over time, they just wear on you. And it's just wave after wave of big bodies coming at you in the running game. That's not what this is. Kalen DeBoer, and now reunited with Grubb as the offensive coordinator, those guys, when they've been together, they throw the rock around. They love to throw the football. Actually, Grubb got fired from his job with the Seahawks last year, in part because he just wouldn't run the football. I mean, that's a fact. He just threw the football more than they were willing to tolerate out there. They felt that he cost them a couple games by being too pass happy. But the thing is, he's a really, really good coordinator, and they do a great job of game planning. They're really hard to stop, and the passing game that they put together is one of the best in the country, and they have a good sense for how to make their quarterbacks very comfortable. But again, what they do now, last year was a real exception for a DeBoer team. They ran it more than they threw it last year. 488 rushing attempts, 354 passing attempts, but they also were starting a running back at quarterback. So kind of have to grade on a curve there. You go back to 2023 Washington, 411 carries for 1,776 yards. It's about 4.3 per carry. 574 pass attempts for 51-55. That was Michael Penix. That was the year they went to the national title game. 2022 Washington, 400 carries, so 11 fewer than the year before in a couple fewer games. And 575, or one fewer game actually, 575 attempts for 4807. So this one more pass attempt and 11 fewer carries. So very similar ratios in the 2 years that they were at Washington. And each year with one of the best offensive lines in their conference, and actually one of the best in the country in 2023, still averaging 4.76 and 4.32 yards per carry, which is not that much. Then 2021 at Fresno State, 439 carries for 4.06 yards per carry and 514 passing attempts. They're going to throw the football. That's what they do. And if they have a quarterback that they feel can actually push the ball down the field, they're going to throw it down the field a bunch, and they're going to try to get big plays, and they're going to try to wear you out in the secondary. That's what they do. And that's even going to be more the case, I think, with starting running back Jam Miller out for the game. He's going to be replaced by Richard Young, who was 27 carries for 146 yards last year. Daniel Hill, 21 carries for 61 yards, not actually that great as a freshman. And then they've got a transfer from Louisiana Lafayette and Dre Washington. They're going to try to figure out which one of those could be a hot hand to be, a good option in the running game to replace the steady, big-bodied Jam Miller, who would have been the guy that would start. Now, the interesting thing is, it's pretty obvious to me, given this roster, that if Roydell Williams had stayed at Alabama instead of transferring to Florida State, he would be the starter for Alabama at running back in this game. I don't think there's any question about that. So that's an interesting sort of thing to think about. Now, they're also likely to be without their starting right guard, also a pretty highly regarded NFL prospect in Jaden Roberts. He's been in the concussion protocol. Odds are he's not going to play this game, but we'll see. Regardless of that, though, this is probably one of the 5 or so best offensive lines in the country, if not the best. You got Caden Proctor, the surefire early NFL draft pick, all of about 350 pounds there at left tackle, and, dancing bear type of athlete, just an elite athlete at that size. Though some rumblings that he was a little overweight in camp and maybe not in the kind of shape that he ought to be. Cam Dewberry, the transfer from Texas A&M, really good, really powerful as a senior transfer at left guard. Parker Brailsford, who is a junior center, and he's going to play in the NFL. So they got a future NFL center. Gino Vandemark likely to be the starter at right guard. He's a redshirt freshman who started a number of games last year as well. And then sophomore Wilkin Formby at right tackle. Now, to me, the left side of this offensive line is almost certainly the best left side of any offensive line in the country. You go from Parker Brailsford, who's an NFL offensive center, Cam Dewberry, who's an NFL guard, and Caden Proctor, who's an early round pick at left tackle. That's as good as it gets right there. And Florida State's going to have to hold up against the left side of that offensive line, which is, if I'm looking at this matchup for Alabama, I'm saying I want to see if Florida State can hold up against those dudes if I just try to run it down their throat some. But we'll see. I do find it interesting though that Brailsford is 6'2", 290. He's not actually the biggest center. He's a very good one, but he's not as big as a lot of other guys out there. And I do wonder if you put a guy like Darrell Jackson, who's just a freak and outweighs him by almost 40 pounds, you put him in the zero technique at times and put him over him and just tell him to kick his butt over the course of the game. How much might that wear on him? How much does that actually change what they have to do in terms of giving their center some help against a guy who's just a freak? Can you do that? And I don't know. I don't know. Now, if that weren't enough, I think they probably have the best wide receiver group outside of Columbus, Ohio. It's my guess. Certainly a top 5 wide receiver group. Ryan Williams, everybody knows about him. Everybody's talking about how he was only 17 last year. Well, he's 18 this year, and he's better. Isaiah Horton, the 6'4" Miami of Florida transfer, and then Jeremy Bernard, who is a transfer from Washington, where he was with Grubb and DeBoer before. He's, they've got some dudes, and they've got some mismatch problems. Ryan Williams is going to be a problem for every player that faces him all season, not just the guys on Florida State's roster. And to some degree, you're just going to give some stuff up against him. He's just a freak. So you try to limit the damage. Tight ends, okay. I don't think they're likely to be a major factor in this game for them. But they've got some. They're pretty good. But I think most of their damage comes from their wide receiver crew. To me, so much of this game, though, ultimately comes down on this side of the ball to Ty Simpson. Redshirt junior, first-time starter. This is the way it used to be. You go back to Florida State's dynasty years, and every couple of years they were rolling out a new redshirt junior starter. And the dynasty finally went down when they had to start a freshman. When we had to start a freshman, when I was actually there. But, we don't really know what he is at this point. We know he's a good athlete. That, you watch him run on some of the quarterback run game stuff that he'd done when he was in games, and he's a good athlete. He will be a threat to pull on pull reads and things like that, and to use his legs to get first downs. It's nice, big body. But other than that, what do you really know? He hasn't played very much. The accuracy rate when he did play in 2024 and 2023, he's 88%. It was only about 85% in 2024. Castellanos, for what it's worth, his accuracy rate is 83.3%. So that kind of gives you an indication where they're at. High 80s is usually pretty darn good. But here's maybe the most interesting piece that, I've kind of pulled is in his opportunities, in his time, his limited time as, in garbage time and all of that at Alabama, his pressure to sack ratio of 30% is a potential crimson flag for Alabama. Because that's really high. You want a pressure to sack ratio certainly below 15, especially for more of a pocket passer type. Below 15 is good. Below 10 is elite. Castellanos, for what it's worth, is 23.2%, which is, a lot of dual threat type guys have a little higher there. That's still not great, but 30% is high. That's That makes me wonder about what you can do if you can find ways to get some pressure on him. Does that end up rearing its head? Does his difficulties against pressure end up rearing their head in this game? Now, going through the losses that they had last year, if you want to look at what the primary commonalities were, it's two simple things. Poor running game in really 3 of the 4, if not, depending on how you regard the Vandy game, I would say poor running game in all 4. And then losing the turnover battle in 3 of the 4. Against Vandy, they were -2 in the turnover margin and 84 total rushing yards with a 4.0 yards per carry rushing average. Tennessee, they were actually +1 in the turnover margin and still lost, but they were only 75 yards on the ground at a 2.21 yards per carry output. Oklahoma, -2 in the turnover margin, 70 yards rushing, 2.33 yards per carry. Again, against Michigan, -2 in the turnover margin, 68 rushing yards at 2.34 yards per carry. The Michigan and Oklahoma games are almost carbon copies of each other statistically, at least on the offensive side. So for me, I look at this and I go, wow, they had that offensive line. They had those dudes. And there were times last year where they could not run the football. That's interesting to me. And now I ask the question, how much does that shift going from having a running back at quarterback in Jalen Milroe? How much does that shift to when you're having a more pass-heavy approach and a better passer? Because, I mean, regardless, it's almost certain that with Ty Simpson, he's going to be a better passer than Milroe, who was a running back playing quarterback. But, how much does that allow them to handle defenses that can limit their run game more? Where, okay, fine, you can take the run away, but we're going to counter by throwing it all over the yard. Will they be able to better handle that kind of imbalance if they don't run the ball well? I would guess yes, but we just don't know. And, Tony White's defense focuses heavily on stopping the run. That is a prime emphasis. White will give up some big plays in exchange for getting you off the field more quickly, more often, and not letting you run the ball down his defense's throat. Which is very much the opposite from what Florida State has been the last couple of years. Last year, Florida State was 99th in run defense, giving up 4.82 yards per carry against FBS competition. White's Nebraska was 16th, giving up actually yard and a half fewer yards per carry, 3.35 yards per carry. 16th is great, but not elite. Is good, but not elite. But that's orders of magnitude different from what Florida State was last year when they went light box all the time and sort of were willing to let teams run the ball in exchange for taking away the pass. Tony White's defense is generally going to do the opposite. Now, here's where we come to the questions on this side of the ball. Will White's defense be able to replicate the success that he had at Nebraska in the running game, stopping the running game? Will they be able to replicate that success against the Bama team with that offensive line? But Bama also does have some questions in the backfield and just in general in the running game after last year. But that's a big question. Will Alabama be able to run the football against White in this defense? If so, if they're able to run the football, I think that's game over. If they're able to run the football with some consistency, I think that's game over. But given that commitment that White has to stopping the run and what I think is going to be a pass-happy approach for Bama this year, the next question is, will Florida State's secondary be able to hold up well enough against Ryan Williams and that wide receiver core? Can they find a way to rattle Ty Simpson into a turnover or 3? Those questions to me determine this game on this side of the ball. Now, my guess is that Florida State does a better than expected job limiting the running game. I think they're going to be able to hold Bama under about 100 yards rushing. But I do think they're going to give up some big plays in the passing game in exchange. I think you're going to see Ryan Williams with a long touchdown or 2. I think you're probably going to see, 3 touchdowns, maybe 4 touchdowns from Ty Simpson. But I do think they also are likely to force a turnover or two in exchange for that, as they do. I think they're going to get some pressure on Simpson, not because of the offensive line, not because of necessarily beating those guys a bunch, but because White is going to be able to dictate some free rushers here and there. And, one of the things that White does so well is that they simulate pressure and they mug the backers. They do a lot of different things and then get into a safer coverage look from that. But they're forcing offensive linemen and protection guys to give up some one-on-ones. And I do think that you're going to see Darrell Jackson, Jason Jenkins, that group of guys, along with James Williams, some of these guys, I do think you're going to see some of those guys get some one-on-one wins that will generate some pressure here. So I think Bama's going to average under 4 yards per carry in the running game, but they'll throw for over 300 yards. I'm expecting them to score about 31 points in this game. So in terms of this side of the ball, that's where I've got it. And that presumes, again, Florida State not turning it over a bunch. If Florida State goes out there and turns it over 3 or 4 times, this is going to get ugly. Bama's going to score, 48. That sort of game. Now, on the flip side, on the other side of the ball, Florida State's offense against Bama's defense. Regardless of what you think about the trash talking and all that over the summer and, the bravado and all this, Tommy Castellanos is right about one thing. This is not Nick Saban's Alabama defense. Gone are the days of Saban's match coverage, Rip Liz system with huge athletes up front plugging the gaps in the running game and forcing you to throw into that really tight match coverage, which looks like man, but is really more of a matchup zone. Kane Womack's defensive approach is a lot closer to what Tony White does, where it's an aggressive one-gapping system from a hybrid front. They're really a 3-man front with that fourth jack backer who's about 240, 245 pounds. Very similar kind of body, but a better overall athlete, bigger overall body than Omar Graham, but very similar to that. And they're going to be aggressive, trying to get downhill, create problems and leakage in the backfield, getting penetration with a simpler, primarily spot drop zone defense as the default behind that. So that's what they do. And the place where they're much more like Nick Saban's Alabama is they're still loaded with blue chip defenders all over the field. I think they're going to have 3 5-star defensive linemen starting. The luxury of that is wild. I mean, that's, Florida State in 2013 kind of stuff. Depending on what service you're looking at. I mean, but they're all blue chippers, and they're blue chippers everywhere else. The whole defense is a blue chip ratio of like 100. But they did lose their best run-stopping defensive tackle, likely early round pick, Tim Keenan III, 315-pound defensive tackle who's very disruptive. He's out for this game, it looks like. And to me, that's a big, big, big deal. They do have talent behind him. They're Alabama. But there's nobody quite like him with his specific skill set. He's a problem. He would be a problem for Florida State's offensive line. And that also cuts into their depth a little bit there. But I think him not being there is a big, big deal. Now, what's interesting is despite Womack's kind of aggressive approach, Bama's rush defense wasn't actually elite last year. And all those athletes that they have, all of the emphasis on getting downhill and that one gap stuff, they gave up 3.74 yards per carry. That's 26th nationally against FBS competition. That's very good. It's in the good range, not quite as good as Tony White's Nebraska. They played a better schedule, so, kind of your mileage will vary there, but pretty comparable to what White did at Nebraska. But not elite, not what they've been. And in their losses, there's some commonalities in this part of the game. In the loss at Vandy, 54 carries for 166 yards, only 3.07 yards per carry, but Vandy still ran it 54 times. At Tennessee, 43 carries for 214 yards, 4.98 yards per carry. Tennessee actually gashed him pretty good. Oklahoma, 50 carries for 257 yards, 5.14 yards per carry. Oklahoma gashed him even more than Tennessee did. And then finally, Michigan, 51 for 115, 2.25 yards per carry. So they were able to stop that Michigan offense pretty well. Now, that Michigan offense had no quarterback and so on, but Michigan still was able to win, partly because of the turnover situation there. Really, that was a turnover-determined game. But the commonality here, each of those teams, even though Michigan didn't run it for very much, each of those teams ran the football 40-plus times. And 3 of them ran it over 50 times. So in Bama's 4 losses last year, if you were going to beat Bama, you were going to run the football more than 40 times and probably more than 50 times. That's just how it was done last year. Enter Gus Malzahn and Tommy Castellanos. And also, what I think is the best starting offensive line that Mike Norvell has had at Florida State by a good margin. They are going to be committed to pounding the rock. That's what Gus Malzahn has always done. It's what Mike Norvell also believes in, but hasn't always been able to do at Florida State. They're gonna run the football, and they're gonna try to run it. And look, if Gus Malzahn can run it 60 times against Alabama, he's gonna do it. That's what they do. And Castellanos' legs are going to be a huge factor in this game. I mean, Malzahn tormented more talented Bama teams with running quarterbacks at Auburn for years. Look for him to try to do more of the same here, even though it's a different kind of defense. And if Bama does wind up having to overcommit and sell out to stop the run here, look for Deuce Robinson and Squirrel White and Pittman to generate some big plays downfield. And also Jalen Lucas as well. I look for Jalen Lucas to have a couple opportunities in this game for some really big plays. I think they're itching to get him in good positions in that gadget role in this game. But both Norvell and Malzahn have a long track record of scheming wide open big plays in big games. And I expect to see 3 or 4 golden, great opportunities in this game where there's just going to be guys who are schemed open. And the question is, will Florida State be able to execute and finish on those opportunities? Is Castellanos going to put the ball in a place where the guy can catch it, or is he going to airmail it? Are these guys going to catch the football and do what they're supposed to do in that context? On the flip side, if Alabama can consistently win first down and get Florida State behind the chains most of the game, this game could very easily get ugly because this is not a Florida State team that's going to throw the football all over the yard in, standard drop back, quick game type stuff. They're going to have to RPO it. They're going to play action it off of the run threat. They're going to need to be able to run the football in order to do that. But I don't think Alabama is going to consistently win first down and keep FSU behind the chains most of this game. I actually think Florida State will be able to have that Bama defense off balance much of the game, and I think they're going to pop a few. Look for Florida State to run the football over 45 times in this game for around 200 yards to pair with a few big plays in the passing game, and they're going to score some points against this Alabama team too. That's what I think is going to happen. You're going to see Castellanos get free and get some of those key third down conversions, get some of those 15-yard runs on first down to set up the tempo and get that offense rolling. And that's another thing, by the way, Malzahn will turn up the tempo, and they're going to have some things where, again, they will keep you off balance, and they're going to have some things off that tempo where you're just struggling to get lined up and get moving, and all of a sudden he's doing some sort of little trick gadget thing where they're going to be ready to roll. That's what's going to happen. And I think there's going to be a couple of those in this game. Now, moving on to special teams, this is actually the place where I do think Florida State should have a clear advantage. There's a lot of concern coming out of Tuscaloosa about Bama kicker Connor Talty, who is very inconsistent through camp. And you contrast that to the confidence that Florida State has in new kicker Jake Weinberg and punter Mac Chimento. Both of those guys seem to be very solid. The one place where I think, you've got some concern and some question marks there is punt returner. It's just the one place where you haven't seen these guys really do it yet. And for me, just catch the ball. Just make sure you don't lose a bunch of yards with the ball hitting the ground or muffed punts and that sort of thing, giving up, cheap turnovers. Just find the guy who can catch it and you're fine, because I think the rest of special teams, I think Florida State actually has an advantage there. So that's interesting that in that phase, it should favor the underdog here. Now it's time for final analysis and prediction time. Bama obviously has an overall talent advantage and a significant depth advantage coming into this game. They've got a much better roster. There's no question. If you ask these coaches to trade rosters, I'm pretty sure Mike Norvell and company would trade rosters in a heartbeat, because Bama has a ton of talent and they got a lot of big bodies on both lines, and they'd find a way to run the football with that group. They'd find a way to make it work. But it's a season opener, which is when depth probably matters the least of any game in college football. Number one, that's where your starters are coming in. You're as healthy as you're going to be. And so the depth actually matters less now than it would, say, in November. The other thing is styles make fights. And I think Florida State's style in this game is going to keep this game a much closer game than the spread suggests. I do think Florida State's going to cover. In fact, especially with rain on the forecast, real chance of there being some typical Florida afternoon thunderstorm, and there may be a delay in there. If it's August, end of August in Florida, 3:30 in the afternoon. Why they put it at 3:30 instead of more at 8 o'clock when you're less likely to have that game delay? Look, I'm not the one making these decisions, but everybody knows Tallahassee, Florida, 4:30 in the afternoon, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you're going to get that rain shower about as often as not, and often with some pretty heavy thunder and lightning. So, I mean, there may well be a delay here as well, which further complicates things. But with the rain and all of that as well, makes you wonder how much that impacts the style situation with Florida State being the team that's going to want to ground and pound. Typically, my usual take is that water matters less for the passing game. It hurts the offense less than wind. Wind is what really, really matters. Doesn't look like it's going to be a very windy day. If the field gets slick, a lot of times actually in the passing game that can benefit the offense because they know where they're going. Defenders can slip and slide. But the field should be in good shape, so I don't think that's going to be really a factor. And so at that point, the extra ball handling from throwing and catching, you might get an extra turnover or two, that sort of thing. But the bottom line is, not only do I think Florida State covers in this game, I think Norvell and Malzahn managed to scheme up just enough to keep Florida State in the game deep into the fourth quarter, as both offenses are going to trade some big plays. And I think Florida State's kind of ground and pound, you're going to see them get some, they're going to get some wins against that Bama defense. And look, I know I shouldn't do this because, I know the odds, I know the percentages. I know that Alabama is more likely than not to win this game. I mean, I had this game as a 0.35 or 0.3, whatever in my season preview. And I think that still basically holds. All things being equal, if this game was played 10 times, Florida State might win like 2 of them, maybe 3 of them, maybe 3.5 of them. I don't know. But this is an opener. And given some of the injury stuff, given some of the other questions and all of that, I do think there's more unknowns than usual coming into this game. And there's a lot bigger delta in terms of what might happen. So given that, why not have a little bit of fun with this? I'm going to shoot my shot. I'm going to call for Florida State to pull the upset in this one. I'm going to go with 34-31 Florida State in this game. And I know, look, some of y'all are just going to say, oh, there he goes. He's being a sunshine pumper or whatever. Maybe that's true. But you know what? Styles make fights. I think this Florida State team is going to be a tough team to stop the run. I think there's going to be opportunities to make some plays. And I think some of these guys, Deuce Robinson, Tommy Castellanos, Randy Pittman, Squirrel White, some of these guys are Jalen Lucas. Some of these guys are going to get some opportunities to make some of those big plays. And I think that group of guys is going to be likely to make those plays. And I do think Florida State's overall offensive line is good enough to hold up and give them the opportunity to make those plays. I think this is going to be a really fun one. Win or lose. And this is This is a no-lose situation for Florida State. That's the other thing. If they lose this game, well, that was expected. You guys fought hard. If they go out there and win it, it changes the way that everybody talks about the program. They're playing with house money in this game. That makes you dangerous as a football team. So I'm going to go with it. I'm going to call the shot. 34-31 Florida State. As usual, I'll be back with hot takes right after the game. I'm also looking at doing a live show with some video breakdown on either Sundays or Mondays after games this year. So stay tuned for that possibility. I'll mention that and try to get that set up in the hot takes after the game on Saturday. I'm still trying to figure out the best way to do that with the current setups and things. Those of you who've been listening since the beginning of this podcast will probably remember that I was actually doing that about a decade ago, and doing, film breakdowns and all that in a live show pretty often at that time, but I've had to drop it for a few years. Looking at picking back up with that this year, and going to try to get that going right after the Alabama game here within the next couple days after that. So if I'm able to get that set up, we'll also add that. But either way, talk to you soon right after the game. Looking forward to it. It's going to be a fun one, y'all. Enjoy it. Enjoy having a team that's actually going to be more entertaining and more fun to root for, because they're actually going to play hard and care. Till then, this has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Doc Staples. Thanks for listening. If you've been enjoying this podcast, please leave a 5-star rating over at Apple Podcasts and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Post and repost episodes on social media, and tell a friend. And if you haven't left a review in a while, do it again. It really does help the visibility of the podcast. Before we go, I'd also like to thank my advertising partners once more. That's EPR Creations, Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. You can also stop by the Unconquered Shop at unconqueredpodcast.com, where you can buy stickers, pins, magnets, t-shirts, and other swag. I am especially grateful for those of you at the Dynasty level. That is Brian Leininger, Dave Blair, Jack Horton, Jonathan Kennedy, Lee Caswell, Travis Smith, and Tyler Kashishki. You all are far more generous than I deserve. Thanks to you all. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Jason Staples. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. I made this.